Hi everyone, welcome back to lecture guide number 6 on Post-Impressionism and Expressionism. At this point in the quarter, we're moving a little bit away from questions about what's going on in the historical context of the time to questions about, the fundamental question you'll be looking at over the next few weeks is how artists responded to their historical time period and the interests of modernism. Or a simpler way to put this is, I think a lot of people have questions about why artists turned away from accurate representations or idealistic representations, as we saw in classical aesthetics, towards greater and greater degrees of abstraction. Now, modern art and abstract art are not exactly synonymous terms. Many artists of the modern period were not necessarily full abstractionists, but they tend to go together. And so we'll be looking at the question of why did artists move away from a kind of photorealistic or idealistic representation of the world towards greater and greater degrees of abstraction, which, by the way, just simply means a simplification or alteration of the natural representation of forms towards something else. So why did they do these types of things? Well, what we said last week, especially when we were looking at Edouard Manet's work, is that, of course, modernism, not just in the arts, but in society in general, had to do with an interest of kind of sorting through the traditions that you received from the past. So within painting, for instance, receiving the traditions of classicism and saying, which ones of these traditions are still important and relevant to the present. So it's a kind of critical movement in which you say, for instance, as we saw in Manet, maybe the subject matter of ancient Roman or Greek ideas isn't particularly relevant today, and I want to focus on the subject matter of everyday scenes. But even more importantly, it has to do with the idea of saying, I'm a painter. What can painting do better than any other art form? Or I'm a sculptor. What does sculpture do better than any other art form? And trying to focus on what the strengths of your medium might be. Even more specifically, artists were interested in the question of how the form elements or visual elements of their medium, whether it be painting or sculpture in our case, could be used to express or to communicate messages beyond just recognizing, hey, this is a figure in a landscape doing this or that. In other words, part of the question that modern artists were trying to get an answer to is how can I use the physical or visual properties of my art form to communicate or express or evoke an idea directly rather than, through just a recognizable subject matter. And we'll try to, emphasize this over the next few weeks and talk about the different approaches that they had. Post-Impressionism, so really right now think about how each stylistic movement that we cover approaches this question a little bit differently. So Post-Impressionism is one of those terms, and it's the first movement that we'll be looking at today. Which is a little bit of a dumping ground as a stylistic label. Anytime you hear the terms pre or post in relation to a stylistic movement, know that it's a little kind of wishy-washy. It's not as defined, let's say, as classicism or romanticism. And in post-impressionism, as the stylistic label makes clear, these are the artists who come immediately after impressionism. There are artists such as Auguste Rodin, ToulouseLautrec, Paul Cezanne, Seurat, Vincent Van Gogh, Edvard Munch, and so forth. Here, post-impressionism, the one thing that kind of draws together all of these artists is that they are very interested in the things that the Impressionists were doing in their work, and people like Manet as well, but they felt that those artists of Impressionism weren't quite rigorous enough, that they weren't really following through on some of the explorations that they had undergone. Or another way to put this is, let's say Monet says, as we said last week, that great Impressionist painter, that he wanted to achieve a painting that was a kind of representation of what his own naive eye saw in the world before his brain turned it into something else. And for Monet, painting a scene in which you'd have a blob of yellow in the painting, or a little oblong of pink, or whatever it might be, those types of abstractions, they are simplifications of the way that the world looks, corresponded directly to what his retina was receiving when it came to light information. But he wasn't really pushing that further, so a lot of these artists that you'll see were investigating almost on a scientific level how the properties of light and color and form could express the ideas that they wanted to communicate. Auguste Rodin is sometimes, and that's who you're looking at here on the screen, is a sculptor. He's one of the most important modern sculptors of his day. He's oftentimes associated with Impressionism, but stylistically we put him into the category of Post-Impressionism. Sculpture as an artistic form is always lagging a little bit behind painting, partially because it's so much more expensive to do sculptures than it is to do paintings, and so you really need to have someone out there that's willing to buy your work if you're willing to put in the time and the money to create, as Auguste Rodin did, these giant bronze sculptures, which are incredibly expensive. So you can't, like a painter, just do an exploratory new art form and hope that someone buys it. You tend to kind of, again, be more conventional than the painters, less exploratory. Auguste Rodin always wanted to be in the French Royal Academy, and he was turned down no less than 5 times before finally they let this work that you're looking at into the French academic salon, those giant exhibitions. The work is called The Age of Bronze, and originally it was called The Vanquished. It's probably a reference to the Franco-Prussian Wars, where the French actually lost pretty embarrassingly to the Germans, and the Germans just marched into Paris briefly and then left. And he's originally he's talking about the feeling of being vanquished, being overcome by a more important foe. But more importantly, when he finally exhibits this, he calls it the Age of Bronze, and just like Manet, what he's doing is he's taking a very traditional type of figure, male nude, and he's representing it, and by the way, these male nudes, of course, go all the way back to ancient Greece, 450 or so BCE, and turn up again in the Roman period, and the classical, neoclassical period in France, and so forth. We covered this at the beginning of this quarter. More importantly, just like Manet, he's taking this very traditional art form. Manet had worked with the female nude, Rodin's working with the male nude, and he's representing it in a new kind of modern style. So a couple of the things that he's changed from classicism is, number one, the human form is not idealized. It's much more naturalistic, meaning it looks like a real body. He's carefully, looking at the way that the musculature of a real body looks. He's not trying to change the rational proportions that a classicist would do. He's trying to represent it as it might look, as accurately as he can. That's number one. Number two, you can probably see this. It's a bronze cast sculpture made out of the famous lost wax process that we've talked about before. He has patinaed the surface. It's very kind of shiny so that it will play with light effects. And those light effects, as you walk around the sculpture, change and thus animate the figure. It makes it look more like it's a lifelike figure. Now, when he represented this in the academic salon, he was beat up for both of these qualities. The academics, those people associated with classicism, wanted an idealized form, and so they accused him of actually casting from a life figure. this form and said it was too naturalistic and didn't show any of the idealism that you would expect from a classical artist. And number two, they hated the fact that this surface looked like an Impressionist painting with all these dancing highlights of light over the surface. So it wasn't a big success in the Academy. Rodin, of course, is most famous for works like this, The Thinker. And The Thinker is one of those works that, again, draws from the classical tradition. It's very standard for someone to show in both sculpture and paintings a figure deep in thought by putting his hand on his chin like this. But the big difference that Rodin made to his sculpture is he simplifies it. The face of this figure, if you can see it at all, is totally simplified. It's not a very accurate representation. The brow of the figure is emphasized, the hairline comes down very low, and that emphasis on kind of removing all the facial expression is to communicate the idea that this figure is deep in thought. But the most important work for our purposes when it comes to Rodin, this is just a photograph of Rodin next to his sculpture, by the way, is this work. This work is called The Burghers of Calais, and it originally was a commission from the city of Calais for a memorial sculpture to commemorate something that happened in its history. The Burghers of Calais commemorates a moment in the 100 Years' War between the English and the French. If you don't know this, the English and the French were constantly, warring against each other from the Middle Ages forward, and the English actually claimed a lot of what is today Western France as their own, especially northwestern France, where Calais is. And at one point in their history, under the reign of King Edward III, in the middle of the 14th century, the English had besieged this city of Calais, but neither side was winning. And so the English said, listen, if you give up for execution 6 of your most prominent citizens, these leaders of Calais, known as burghers, we will lift the siege and let the rest of you live. So the city of Calais goes to Rodin and says, we'd like a commemorative sculpture of this. Rodin agrees to do this. He submits a sculpture that is a lot more naturalistic than what you see here. But then over the course of the years that it takes him to actually create this, because to create a multi-figure bronze sculpture takes quite a bit of time, he keeps changing his form and getting much more expressionistic. So Expressionism is a new term for us here, and we really need to get our minds wrapped around this. Expressionism, on the one hand, as you'll see coming up later in today's lecture, refers to a series of artistic stylistic movements that really start in Germany just after the turn of the century. But the idea of Expressionism is being developed here by the Post-Impressionist. And what Expressionism means is that you alter or change or manipulate the way that a realistic form would look in order to express an emotional state or a feeling. And we'll look at this carefully in this sculpture. So when Rodin actually gave this sculpture to the people who commissioned it in Calais, they refused it because it was too modern. It didn't look idealized and so forth. So what Rodin is trying to get at here in this sculpture is the way that it would feel if you were one of these 6 people who were sacrificing yourself for your city, for the citizens of your city. And instead of creating a very heroic monument, something like the raising of the flag over Iwo Jima, which is that famous memorial sculpture later on in the 20th century commemorating World War II, where those soldiers are planting the flag, a very kind of common and recognizable memorial sculpture. What he's trying to do is get at the psychological state of people who have sacrificed themselves for something. What are they thinking? How are they feeling? And how can I express this in ways that aren't just showing facial expressions, but actually showing the body language of the figures, manipulating form so as to communicate a deeper psychological message. So number one of the ways this is not idealized, of course, is that the human forms are not submitted to that canon of proportions. If anything, their proportionality is horribly wrong because, as you'll see in some of the close-ups I give you, their hands have been exaggerated to be even bigger so that Rodin can emphasize the anguish that might come from someone gripping their hands or raising their hands and worrying. Their feet have been exaggerated, their legs made bigger, as if on walking to their own execution, their legs get very heavy, they don't want to go. The body postures of these figures have been exaggerated so as to give you a feeling of their inner angst all the way through. And that's what we mean by expressionism. You take a fairly naturalistic form and you exaggerate or manipulate that form in order to express an idea. Another big innovation of the sculpture, and you can't quite tell from this picture, it's not quite the same as how it would have been originally exhibited, is that he takes these sculptures, which were always set up on a pedestal, especially heroic monumental sculptures, and he brings it right down to earth so that you interact with it directly rather than looking at it high above you. So a close-up of this, one of the things that's really interesting about this sculpture is depending on which angle you look at it, you get a totally different view. You get different ideas about what's going on. Sometimes when you look at the sculpture from one side, it looks like everyone's walking in the same direction. Other times you look at it, it looks like people are wandering off into their own spaces or own worlds as if they're lost in their own thoughts. Or from this angle in the back, you see this huge figure kind of pushing everyone along, like saying, we've got to do this. And that's, something that a classical sculpture wouldn't have done. Let's look at some of the exaggerations, right? So walking from this angle, you can see that people look like they're turning and shifting in different directions. Looking at this guy here, you can see that he's over-exaggerated the facial expression, even more of a frown, more deeper set eyes. The hands are huge, and if you look at his left hand, it's gripping his shackles in ways that show his inner turmoil. This is exaggerating the way something looks in order to express an emotional state. So it's very modernist, right? The artist is changing the accurate representation, emphasizing certain aspects of the form and exaggerating that form in order to express some type of deep psychological state of the figures. If we turn now to painting, you see also in painters such as ToulouseLautrec an interest in showing you things that, let's say, the Impressionists didn't show you, and of course showing form in a way that isn't necessarily an accurate representation, again to express something, to evoke a feeling. Believe it or not, this painting that you're looking at here by Henri ToulouseLautrec is something you've seen before. It's called the Moulin de la Galette, and before we saw it in Renoir's work. Remember, Renoir just focused on all the pretty aspects of this café concert where young people are enjoying themselves, middle-class leisurely life, unfolding before us. Every woman is pretty, every man is handsome. There's not any angst or feeling of alienation in his picture whatsoever. But if we go back to ToulouseLautrec, you'll notice what he's focusing on in the way that he's painted this with these really jagged lines, with the almost monochromatic palette that looks somber. It looks, a little bit seedy. He's trying to give you the feeling that sometimes at these types of venues, things aren't as pretty as Renoir would have them. There is another feeling that he wants to put his finger on. Now, Henri de ToulouseLautrec is very good at this, partially because of his own historical or personal upbringing. Toulouse-Lautrec actually came from a very rich aristocratic family, but he was not, let's say, well, for one reason or another, either he had a disease early on in his life or he broke his legs. His lower torso and lower legs didn't grow at the same rate as his upper torso and his body. He looked a bit like a little person, or what they called at the time a dwarf. So he didn't fit into everyday society. And so he came from a family of privilege, but he didn't fit into the upper echelons of society because he didn't look like, everyone else. And he found comfort in hanging out with other types of social misfits, people who didn't fit in. He hung out at venues like the Moulin Rouge, a famous burlesque bar, much the same as Manet's bar at the Folies Bergère, and hung out with the lower class people there, or the circus performers, or even more importantly for our discussion today, the prostitutes who, as we saw last week, weren't fitting into society, were alienated from society, were seeking an escape. So he focuses on this kind of seedy underside of society, and he tries to express the feeling in the in this work, the Moulin de la Galette, through the form elements of painting. He tries to give you the feeling of alienation. If you've ever been at a party and you just didn't feel like you fit in at all, everyone else is having fun, but you're not, that's the kind of feeling he wants to express here. On the far right-hand side, you see the figure of the male here. He is separated from the rest of the scene. Notice how this has become a trope now by the banister of the tables. This separation specifically disconnects him from the female figures here, who are all prostitutes sitting on the sidelines waiting for guys to get drunk enough to, offer them some money. And as the dancing goes on here, you even see police. This is a police officer here. This is a police officer here, interacting with the crowd and maybe giving people a bad time. So he's just trying to show you this scene in which not everything's happy, where things are a little bit anxious, where people don't feel connected. And he tries to do that through the form elements of painting. One of Toulouse-Lautrec's most famous works, and the one that I'm going to spend the most time on, is this work called the Moulin Rouge. Most of you know the Moulin Rouge was one of these famous burlesque bars, or bars where the middle class would go, just like the Moulin de la Galette, and just like we saw in Manet's work, the bar at the Folies Bergère, to have a good time. They've made a lot of money. They want to go blow off some steam and enjoy themselves over the weekend. So they would go to these big bars where performers would entertain them. People would drink a lot. Oftentimes men would hook up with prostitutes. It was something that everyone did, but of course you didn't talk about it at work the following Monday. Now, as we saw in Manet, he focused on the plight of the lower class women who would tend bar in these situations. What Toulouse-Lautrec wants to focus on here is kind of the whole feeling of being in these bars and how they operate. So you probably noticed one of the strangest figures is over here on the right-hand side, coming up to, in the scenario that this painting sets up, greet us, the viewer, as we walk into the space. She's dressed to the nines in black, her hair's all made up, but her face has been abstracted into a form that looks a heck of a lot like a mask. And that's the starting thematic. What Toulouse-Lautrec wants to say here is that when you go to these types of bars, everything is a facade. It is a mask. The way that people interact with one another, especially the performers or the maitre d' here, is all about making you feel good about yourself. It's not a real interaction. It's, a facade. So as we enter this space, we're put on alert to watch out for all the facades that are put on. He also, of course, creates this barrier again, the long banister that kind of separates us from the scene, again speaking about social alienation. When you look at the central grouping here, which is key, you notice a bunch of men interacting with two women here at the bar. Now, up until this point, and I didn't show you a ton of these works, but you could find them in a ton of Impressionist paintings, The interaction between men and women, for instance, in a Renoir picture, would be very joyous. Everyone's taking pleasure, flirtations are coming off easy, people are enjoying themselves. Here what we see are three men who are past their prime, they're into and past their middle age, who have come to this bar, one would suppose because, they've got money now and they want to be entertained. But look at their facial expressions carefully. They don't look like they're having fun. They look a little bit kind of down in the dumps, humped over, maybe drinking too much. Everyone's noses and ears are a little too red, which was a symbol for alcoholism. And the people they're sitting down at the table with are assuredly prostitutes who are not incredibly beautiful women, for instance, going all the way back to Ang. They're just everyday, prostitutes, women dressed in kind of goofy clothing, looking to make a buck. And so instead of the romance that you got in classical works of art, or even earlier impressionist works of art, in which, for instance, something as seedy as prostitution still has this element of, romanticism to it, as if there's something good about it. The guys are getting their fantasy fulfilled. Here it looks like the guys have gone to this bar, they've gone to have a good time, but they're not really having a great time, and they're not really enamored with the prostitutes that are sitting at the table, who look a little bit bored to be sitting down with them as well. In the background are other women getting ready to perform, and a little cameo of ToulouseLautrec with his buddy. Here he is, a little bit shorter guy, wandering through the scene. All around the scene, if you can't quite read what this background is, they're mirrored walls, reflecting everything around them. And mirrors become a symbol of what's known as the spectacle. Again, the idea of entertainment, the idea of things that are fake or false, like a mere reflection of the world. These are all the elements of this painting. ToulouseLautrec, too, de-romanticized, prostitutes, sex workers. Up until this point, even I think with Edouard Manet's Olympia, prostitution was always a kind of male fantasy thing. And so you create pictures of really beautiful prostitutes surrounded by, luxury items there and available for you. We called this the nude, the tradition of the nude, rather than the naked, because you tend not to think of what their feelings are when you look at these things, up until Manet's work anyway. But ToulouseLautrec, who hung out with these women, tries to show you what their life is like. So here you're looking at a scene called Morning in the Brothel, or the Brothel. These are women the night after who have, been up all night prostituting themselves, and the next morning they're just worn out. There's nothing glamorous about this. He's just showing you what their lives are really like outside of the male fantasy. Right? So think of Ang's work that romanticizes the heck out of the idea of a sex worker. Or even Manet's work, which, while on the one hand we know that she's got feelings, she feels much more naked than she does nude because of the expression on her face, you still get the idea that she's got some degree of power in the scenario, where, of course, prostitutes in general had very little power in real life. There's nothing romantic about the sex trade at all, although even in today's contemporary media, we glamorize it quite a bit. But he also, of course, admired the beautiful young performers and saw them as very provocative figures. And every once in a while, such as in this work called Woman Adjusting Her Stockings, which is basically like a woman running backstage to pull up her stockings before she goes back on the stage to perform again, he's showing you this fairly erotic figure caught unaware, while we get a look at her in a state of, nudity, pulling up her stockings, which is, a fetishized object. Another artist associated with Post-Impressionism, one that's very difficult to talk about in one of these survey classes because, honestly, his work is incredibly, it's incredibly complicated, is Paul Cezanne. Paul Cezanne, like Edouard Manet, is one of those fathers of modernism, but what Cezanne is best known for is trying to figure out what the logic of painting is. He spent the vast majority of his career not working out of Paris, but rather down in the south of France in a place called Aix-en-Provence, painting scenes either in his studio or outside, as you see here. The painting is called Mont Sainte-Victoire, which he painted thousands of times. And the reason he was painting, frankly, didn't have to do with producing an accurate likeness of, in this case, Mont Sainte-Victoire, but trying to work out how the formal elements of painting, things like line and shape and color and brushstroke, could create not an illusionistic rendering of space, but an optical rendering of space. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that in a moment here. Remember what we said about modernists, that they're interested in what the essence of their medium is. What is the essence of painting? And what Manet said, and what Cezanne here says as well, is that painting, before it is anything else, before it is a likeness of a mountain, is brushstrokes on a canvas arranged in a particular way so as to have a particular effect. For Cezanne, in his thinking about trying to figure out how a painting could generate spatial qualities without creating an illusion of space, like a classicist would create the illusion that you're looking through a window onto another world, Cezanne is thinking something like, well, photography does that really well. Why would I do that in painting? What I need to do is generate space through the properties of color and shape and the arrangement of those forms on the canvas. And he spent his entire life trying to figure this out. The three poles through which Cezanne tries to work are in this painting. Number one, there is the actual Mont Sainte-Victoire. And so I put, a picture of Mont Sainte-Victoire up here on the right. That's what he sees with his eye. That's what his eye registers. That's one thing that he's trying to take into account. On the whole other side of the pole, over here when he's in front of the canvas painting a picture, he's thinking, this canvas with paint on it will be quite different than the actual Mont Sainte-Victoire out there. And this canvas and the way that I apply the paint has its own logic to it. It has its own rules to it. I need to try to figure out what those rules are. Now, right in the middle of those two poles is the idea that the artist is a kind of mediator between them. His sensibility or understanding of nature is going to get in there too. And Cezanne is trying to wed all those together in his final painting. Or another way to put this is to say, Paul Cezanne looks at Mont Sainte-Victoire. That's, Mont Sainte-Victoire has its own being beyond Paul Cezanne's perception of it, right? It exists whether he's there or not. It's got its own look to it and so forth. But there's also Paul Cezanne looking at Mont Sainte-Victoire and understanding or seeing it, perceiving it in a particular way. And on the other end, there is the logic of painting on a canvas itself that is a totally different animal. And we have to fuse all of these things together. So what Paul Cezanne tried to do is find the basic elements in nature that he could use in painting. And he once said famously, quote, "Treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone." What he meant by that was, in nature you can find these basic building blocks: a cylinder, a sphere, and a cone. Now, if these things are made flat, of course, in the cylinder you get a kind of rectangular form, the sphere becomes a circular form, the cone becomes a triangular form, but he's thinking about these things in 3 dimensions. And then he says, basically try to find these forms and paint them in your canvas itself. He also famously said he wanted to do Poussin over from nature, by which he meant, of course, that famous painter we started off this class with, the French academic Nicolas Poussin, was putting conventions or idealizing his nature, and what Cezanne wanted to do is find the ideal in nature to paint it. Now let me go back here to the painting itself. The most important thing for you to recognize here is, first of all, when you look at this canvas, it's incredibly flat. No one's going to be tricked into thinking this is, deep illusionistic space. He doesn't use atmospheric perspective. He doesn't use linear perspective. He doesn't even really use overlapping of form to create an illusion of 3 dimensions. It looks like it's got a little bit of space, though, to it. It generates its own what we call optical space, a space that just exists for the eye. Not a space you can imagine walking through, but just a space for the eye, optical space. Because he knew that blue, when we perceive blue, feels like it is receding away from us, going away from us. And that warmer colors like, in this case, oranges and yellows and a little bit of green, which is, of course, yellow mixed with blue, will tend to look like it is in front of blues or advancing towards us. So when he puts blue up here at the top, what happens is that the color effect of blue makes that look like it's further away from us. When he puts yellows and oranges mixed with greens in the middle ground here, that makes it look like that whole area is closer to us. But then to assert the idea that the truth of this painting is that it is a 2-dimensional surface covered with paint, in the foreground he puts blue again, which makes the whole thing fold up like a folded piece of paper or go flat again. My point here is just simply this. Rather than using conventions drawn from, classical traditions in order to generate the illusion of 3-dimensionality, what Cezanne is doing here is using color itself, blue and warm tones, or cools and warm tones, to create the 3-dimensionality or optical dimensionality of this painting. This is that painting up close. You can see he doesn't try to hide any brush stroke. When you get up close, it's just brush strokes on the surface of the canvas. I wanted to mention this as well because Cezanne will have a huge effect on the cubists who come after him. This is a still life with apples. He painted a ton of these just boring subjects of still lives, trying to work out, again, the logic of painting. And one of the things he figured out, of course, is that paintings are painted over time, which is different than the way that we see the world, where you see something and you imagine the example of a photograph, where you see something, you click the shutter and it captures that one momentary glimpse of the world. When you're painting, it takes hours and hours of time to paint it, and you're constantly moving your eyes when you're looking at something, and you may even get up and move around and see things from different angles of view, right? We all know this. Just look at something for a minute and you'll notice your eyes kind of moving around the surface. When you want to get a better view on something, you oftentimes tilt your head one way or the other to see it from a slightly different angle. And what Cezanne started doing is trying to synthesize all the different points of view that he was having in front of an object into the painting itself. So this little diagram shows you that. If you're wondering why that painting looks so weird, it's because he's painted it from all of the different angles of view represented by the eyes on that diagram that he used to see that object, and then he fused it all together into the 2-dimensional surface of the canvas itself. The later cubists will do this quite a bit. They'll try to say, hey, a painting is not a snapshot of a single moment in time. It's the representation of an experience that unfolds over time. In order to get time back into the painting, I will synthesize all of these different angles of view that I use to see this object. Let me pause here for just a brief moment. I'll be back in a second. So if we move on now to what we're starting to see here with people like Cezanne and this artist, Georges Seurat, is them taking some of the things that they've learned from the Impressionists, such as brushstrokes on a canvas mimicking the way the eye looks, and trying to submit these to some new observations that were coming out of, in particular, color theorists of the time. There are a whole host of people, basically in the sciences, trying to determine what the effects of color were on the human psyche. What we've learned so far are things like warm colors tend to advance towards us and expand, cool colors tend to recede from us and create space by receding and contracting into themselves. And what these artists of the post-impressionist period did is really investigate this a lot more almost scientifically than the impressionists did. So Seurat, in this famous work that I think probably everyone's seen at some time, called Sunday Afternoon on the Island of the Grand Jatte, used a new technique that you won't be able to see so well here, but if you look this painting up and look at it up close, you'll see that he paints this in a technique that he called chromoluminism. It's best known as pointillism, where every little touch on the canvas is a little dot of a color next to another color. And what he thought was that if you put, for instance, blues next to yellows, your eye will optically mix these two little dots of color and create green. And that's much more like the way that we view the world, because the optical mixing of pigment colors mimics the way that light actually interacts. So this whole canvas, which is a huge canvas, is painted with little dots of paint all over the surface of the canvas in order to create that color. The subject matter here is just a park outside of Paris that he has rendered in this form. He has also, and so it's a perfect kind of scene of this park. It's not a scene in which you have trash around or children screaming or something of that sort. It's supposed to be an idealized view of the world. He's also used some techniques that would have been used by classical artists. Notice how everything is set up on a diagonal, like this figure here in the deep background, and then this figure, and then this figure, and then this figure, or these figures on axis down to these figures here. It's got a very, very rigorous organization or composition of form in order to get to the idea of ideals in the world. And just going over this very quickly, we could spend forever on all of these paintings, but I just want to give you an idea of what the post-impressionists were up to. So Seurat then, in other words, is taking this idea of the impressionists of little touches on the canvas of paint in order to create the impression of what something looks like at a moment in time. And now he's using the technique of pointillism, different pure colors next to each other that would optically mix in the eye in order to create a more accurate representation of how our eye supposedly sees the world. I want to spend a lot more time on this artist, both because he's a crowd favorite and also because he had a huge impact on art that came after him. This is Vincent Van Gogh's very early work called The Potato Eaters. For those of you who have a general idea about Van Gogh being a bit of a crazy guy, let me just kind of set the record straight here. Van Gogh pretty much failed at everything that he tried to do right up until the time that he really devoted himself to painting. He went through a series of careers, his family was very religious. He started as a minister, that didn't work very well. He tried to go into a business, that didn't work very well. And so he finally kind of moved himself into painting. And one of the reasons he kept failing at everything is that he had some kind of social issues, probably coming from a bipolar disorder. He fluctuated through periods of extreme depression and manic highs of exuberant energy. And he was, socially not very adept, and so he alienated a lot of people. A common theme in but here's the thing, I should have said this. Many people get the idea that Van Gogh was painting when he was in a depressed state or when he was completely crazy. He only painted kind of in his middle periods between these fluctuations of extreme depression and manic highs. And so they're not really the products of a deranged mind at all. What Van Gogh seems to have been doing in his painting over and over again is trying to express the feelings that he had inside of him. Early on, this painting, it comes out of the Dutch tradition of genre scenes, low-class subjects, painted in almost a monochromatic palette of, blacks and grays with just a little bit of flesh tones in here. And what he's doing in The Potato Eaters is he's showing you this kind of peasant class having a very meager meal. But he wants to paint it in a way that makes you feel the beauty of these people. And what he sees as their beauty is that they're very natural. They're totally authentic. They're not trying to dress up in finery or, as we just saw in ToulouseLautrec's work, put on any kind of facades. This is them in their intimate interior interacting in a way that is totally authentic. And it's beautiful for being that authentic. It's also beautiful to Van Gogh in that if you notice what's going on in this picture, everyone is doing something for someone else. One person holds the potatoes with a fork while another person serves them. One person is pouring coffee while the other person hands the coffee out to different people and so forth. So he's really interested, and you'll see this over and again, in social interactions. And it's something that he longs for his whole life. He wasn't very good at them, so you see him constantly longing for the kind of intimacy that you see in this very, very early work. Most of Van Gogh's most famous works happen over the course of a period that's a little bit less than 3 years, when he moved to the south of France to a town called ArtH. And this is where you get his really expressionistic paintings. What you're looking at here is a work that is called the Night Cafe. And the cafe in France is a place that most people go to enjoy company of other people. But for Van Gogh, this cafe that was in ArtH was a place that he never felt comfortable. I've always felt anxious in there. And he actually described this place as feeling like, you know, the home of the devil. And he, in this painting, is not trying to, of course, represent the way that cafe looks. This is the key to Expressionism. He's trying to paint the way that cafe feels to him, right? How does this feel to you? Not the way that it looks. And so he, in this mode of Expressionism, changes the way that that cafe looks in order to express the way it feels. Now let's talk about some of the ways that he's done this. Number one, all of the colors in here are complementary colors. Those are colors that are basically across from each other on that color wheel. So when he puts reds next to greens, or this vibrant citron yellow in there, what he's trying to do is create colors that will vibrate against each other because they're complementary. They're opposite each other on the color wheel. And when you put complementary colors together, they intensify the effect of the color. Reds become even more red, yellows even more yellow, greens even more green, and this intensifies our emotional response to the painting. So that's number one. He uses complementary colors that aren't the accurate colors of this space. Number two, look at the space itself. Looking at the floorboards here. Notice how the perspective is all really exaggerated. It's too, the lines converge too much. It looks like something out of a kind of weird sci-fi movie in which the space kind of gets way too big close to us and way too small further away from us. And this is also going to create anxiety in us. As a matter of fact, everything about this is supposed to create some kind of feeling of, uncomfortableness. If you go over to the side where the tables are, is this the wall over here, or is that still part of the floor? And when you have that kind of spatial ambiguity, it's going to bother you. It's going to feel like something's wrong. In the foreground, this rendering of the billiard table with a big, huge shadow coming into our space is also, has this feeling of something uncomfortable. All the characters in the room are not interacting with us. The bar, the guy who's in charge of the bar is standing behind the barrier of the billiard table, not coming up to us intimately. And so everything in this is supposed to express the feeling of something being uncomfortable to him. As he said, quote, in a letter to his brother Theo that's in your readings, I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. In the room is the room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 lemon yellow lamps and a glow of orange and green. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most alien reds and greens and the figures of the little sleeping hooligans in this empty, dreary room. I have tried to express the idea that the cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, run mad, or commit a crime. So I've tried to express it as if it were the powers of darkness in a lowly drink shop. In comparison, look at his bedroom at Arles. This is his own intimate space, and how different this is from what you just saw. Here he's trying to express the idea of comfort. In this room, you have analogous colors, colors that are close to each other on the color wheel and that harmonize with one another. Lots of closely related tones of blue, some earth colors such as brown, just a little dot of red in the bed. He's surrounded by his paintings. His bed, of course, is an area of comfort. There are chairs open for anyone to come in and sit in. Here he's trying to express the idea of comfort and, intimacy. Van Gogh was someone who painted a ton of self-portraits of himself all the way through his life. And I like to think of these things as a kind of introspection. He knew something weird was going on with him. He knew he wasn't like other people. And he used the process of self-portraiture, of painting himself, in order to express what he was feeling at various times in his life. Now this is, again, where he has manipulated form. He's changed the way something would actually accurately look in order to express the feelings that he had inside. Now, to put these back into words, to say, here's exactly what he's feeling, in a way belies the very idea behind Expressionism. We use words all the time to say what we're feeling, right? I'm feeling sad. But how many different feelings of sadness are there? See, here's where the modern painters start to think painting can do something that nothing else can do. It can get at the nuances of human emotions or feelings in a way that words can't. Words are too simplified. I want to try to express the way that I'm feeling through the use of line and color and shape, texture, and so forth. So here, I don't know exactly what he's feeling, but look at all the swirling blue lines behind his head. He's obviously in a state that on the one hand is full of energy, but those lines are all curlicues. They're all soft lines. They're not sharp, jagged lines. And so maybe this is a calm state that he's in. Or here, what is he feeling here? Even more calm, less energy, Or famously, you will have heard the story, I'm sure, that, and we don't know whether it's true or not, but we do know that Van Gogh lost part of his ear at some stage in his life. Rumor has it that he cut off part of his earlobe and sent it to a young prostitute that he was enamored with as a token gesture of his interest in her. Just for the record, guys, don't, if you're trying to impress a woman, don't cut off your body parts and send it to him, obviously. But, whether that's even true or not, we don't know. The latest rumor has it that he got into a fight with the famous painter Paul Gauguin, who had just come to visit him around the time that this event occurred, and that they actually got into an argument and went out into a park and battled each other with swords, and he got part of his ear cut. We don't know for sure. In any case, imagine, though, the original story that he cuts off part of his ear, he's in a really manic state or something weird's going on for him, and sends it off to this young prostitute. And then the next morning he wakes up and thinks, oh my God, what the hell was I thinking? Why did I do that? And then here, what you're seeing in his self-portrait with the bandaged ear is him painting that feeling afterwards of, all of this just occurred. And in this case, he doesn't shy away from, painting a moment in time where he probably is horribly embarrassed by it or depressed about it. And the painting is supposed to express those feelings. It's not an accurate representation, again, of the way he looks. It's him manipulating form in order to express the feelings that he has inside of him. One of the, of course, most famous paintings Van Gogh ever created was created during a time period where he had submitted himself to basically a psychiatric institute in Saint-Rémy, he had undergone psychological treatment on and off through his entire life. And this work is called Starry Night, if you don't already know. And it is a scene of the town that's outside of Saint-Remy, but it's not an accurate representation. It's not him looking out of his window in his insane asylum painting the scene. What he's trying to paint is a feeling again. And here, the key thematic in all of Van Gogh's work, which we've only touched about so far, comes through very clearly. Van Gogh was constantly longing for human connection to other people. He was constantly striving to create relationships with other people, and because he was so kind of socially inept, he kept blowing it, right? He kept alienating people. He kept getting in arguments with them. People didn't get him, but he longed for that kind of connection to something bigger beyond himself, communities, and so forth. Van Gogh is also a pantheist, which we talked about when we were looking at American landscape paintings. Growing up in a very religious society, taught about religion, he was also taught about the idea that God was part and parcel of nature, that a larger kind of energy animated himself and the world around him, and he was seeking to connect to that larger energy of God or the divine or something bigger than himself. He once said, and you'll see this in the letters, that the stars represented him, the larger universe. And when he would look at the stars, he felt connected to them and felt a part of the bigger universe around him. Remember, we were talking about this when we looked at the work of Caspar David Friedrich, for instance, and the monk standing by the sea. Well, here, imagine himself longing to connect to the larger kind of energy of the universe and trying to paint that feeling. The sky is full of all that swirling energy. The stars are rendered by little, dots of yellow, and then around them swirling dots of blue, which are complementary colors, so they intensify each other even more and make that energy even more palpable. The big thing over in the far right-hand side that looks like the moon or the sun is actually the planet Venus, which we know that at this point in time in the south of France was huge. Sometimes Venus, because of our orientation towards the planet, looks very vibrant and big. And Venus, of course, is a symbol for love. The goddess of love is Venus. And he's longing for that kind of connection to things around him. In the foreground is another major symbol of pantheism. This cypress tree looks a little bit like a flame, and it looks even more like a flame in real life. There's reds in the greens here, kind of snaking up into the sky. And that is probably a reference to the Bible, where, of course, Moses is greeted by God in the form of a burning bush. And so we here have a symbol of God or the divine here. Down below in the landscape, we see, similar rolling hills and blues and energy represented by all those brush strokes. And we see a church steeple here that rhymes the shape of the cypress tree. So this analogy between the church and the cypress tree is one that is meant to say, the church is a house of God, but nature is also the realm of God itself. And if you were to be asked which one is more prominent or important according to the way that Van Gogh has represented it, you would have to say the bigger cypress tree that's, much closer to us. Finally, of course, historically, going back to ancient religions, the sky is usually associated with spirituality and with the masculine principle. And the earth is related to materiality or the feminine principle, Mother Earth, in the world. And here we have both the cypress tree and the church steeple being the one element that connects these two dualities, male and female, spiritual and material. And he's clearly trying to, reference that as well. Finally, when you get up close on a Van Gogh work, this is up close on the element of Venus in the up right-hand corner. The way that it's painted is really thick brush strokes. This is known as impasto. He doesn't try to clean up the brush strokes. All these textures and all the energy that comes from those rough brush strokes here is something that he wants to express in his painting, so he doesn't smooth that out. He wants that referenced in his work. Just for kind of comic relief, here is a portrait of his doctor, or one of his doctors, Dr. Gachet here, looking, on the one hand very sympathetic, and on the other hand maybe slightly frustrated or at his wit's end when it came to Van Gogh, who, of course, in the end could not tolerate his deep depression and committed suicide. We move now to, well, let me pause here. So sorry, I had my slides a little out of order. We move now to look at a couple of other painters associated with early Expressionism, including this Norwegian artist, Edvard Munch. You're looking at a painting here known as Death in the Sick Room. Edvard Munch had a very difficult life, by the way. He was constantly surrounded by death. His mother died when he was young. His older sister, who started taking care of him, kind of performing the roles of a mother, then died of tuberculosis too, and one of his younger sisters almost died of it as well. And so here in Death in the Sick Room, he's trying to express the idea of grief, or how people gather together lamenting the passing of a person, and how this is, how do we get at this question? If you've ever been to a funeral, or if you've had the tragedy of a death in your family or someone close to you, and you've seen people gather together to lament this death, you'll know that everyone kind of deals with it differently, and there's different stages to that grief. In this painting, that is referenced. If you look at all the figures, they're in the same proximity to one another, and even when they're overlapping one another, they all seem to be turned in different directions and dealing with that grief a little bit differently. He doesn't show a lot of facial expressions to show you grief, people, crying, or, contortions of the face. What he tries to do is express the idea of grief through body postures. So for instance, in the foreground, this girl who's hunched over herself with a very red face, or with this guy kind of wandering off into space. He also tries to express grief through the colors here, very somber colors, primarily blacks and grays, with this pretty kind of sickly looking green in the background, which he associated with illness, and the ochre color, this kind of orangish tan color in the foreground, in order to express that feeling of grief. Everyone deals with it in a different way. Grief is something that is, on the one hand, collective, but it's also very personal and very idiosyncratic. And again, he's not trying to show you what it looks like. He's trying to paint a picture of what it feels like. Now, he'll paint feelings over and over again. He's not into complete abstraction, but he is someone who wants to change the way something looks accurately so as to express this feeling. This is one of his prints. He did a number of prints in order to kind of create visual facsimiles of emotional states. And this one is jealousy. So in the foreground is actually a self-portrait of Edvard Munch over here. And on his face, he feels this feeling of anxiety about, I suppose, his girlfriend going off with someone else, and he expresses that a little through the facial expression, but even more through all the black around him, and through something that is a way of getting at depressive states. Notice how all of the lines and shapes seem to be descending. They seem to be dropping down. Things that drop down or feel like they're falling down to the ground tend to be depressive. Things that rise up tend to feel like they are, pleasurable or exultant. Over to the side is, his worry about women. He had a really twisted relationship when it came to women. This woman is basically a femme fatale, meaning a woman who uses her seductive powers in order to get what she wants, which is emphasized here by an old symbolism. The hair of a woman, long hair, was a symbol of her passion. And here you see long hair kind of enveloping her body, but also reaching out to grab the male figure over here. Look at all these little lines to entrap him in her femininely wiles, I guess. Or, don't use this as a card in order to impress a woman on, let's say, Valentine's Day. But believe it or not, this is his print of attraction. Here are the two figures in the foreground attracted to one another, but it's a really somber, kind of horrible feeling of attraction in which nothing good is going to come out of this. I suppose what he's trying to get at are those moments in time where you're attracted to someone, but you know better about it and it's only going to lead down a bad road. Everything about this is supposed to get at that idea. Or famously, this picture, which he called puberty, where he's trying to get the feeling of a young woman or a young girl entering into, womanhood in the state of puberty and what that feels like. What he's trying to get at is that feeling of, on the one hand, being self-conscious of your body and all of its changes, feeling a little bit worried about this, but also feeling, and you can see this on her face and a little glint in her eyes, a certain degree of happiness over entering into womanhood. He didn't have a very good life, if you can imagine. He's constantly depressed. He thinks, the world is pretty much a bad place. So when he creates his own self-portrait, he calls it, self-portrait in hell. And once again, I think you can get it. This is not an exuberant, happy person. This is a person who feels pretty depressed or is pretty cynical about the world. All these, very deep reds and yellows of the body, and the black, I suppose it's a shadow, hovering in the background, of this figure. His most famous work, though, is this, and it's where I want to spend the most time. Everyone's probably seen this. It's on coffee cups and t-shirts and so forth. This is Edvard Munch's famous work called The Cry or The Scream. And it started with his own personal experience where he had met with some friends, and as they walked away, he felt overwhelmingly kind of isolated or alienated. He didn't feel like he was a part of anyone. He had this kind of overwhelming feeling of anxiety or depression or frankly just alienation. And he tried to paint that emotional state. So obviously this isn't the way that anyone looks. It's not an accurate representation of an actual scene. What he's done is he's compiled very, very, complementary colors, reds and yellows against blues and greens to intensify each other. He's done all these swirling, brush strokes all the way through to give you this feeling of unease. He's accelerated the perspective again to emphasize the space between him and his friends who have walked away from him and feeling disconnected from all things. And he's created himself as if he's a ghostly form, hands on his head, screaming out about this alienation. He's trying to paint an emotional state. As he said, quote, "I stopped and leaned against the balustrade, almost dead with fatigue. Above the blue-black Ford hung the clouds, red as blood and tongues of fire. My friends had left me, and alone, trembling with anguish, I became aware of the vast, infinite cry of nature." So expressing through the form elements of painting, color and line and shape and brush stroke texture, this feeling that he has inside. Expressionism in Germany was more than just a mode of painting. It was also a series of stylistic movements where artists adopted the term expressionism for what they were doing. And one of the most famous early expressionist printmakers and painters was a woman by the name of Käthe Kollwitz. She was also an ardent socialist who married a young doctor who administered to the kind of lower classes in Berlin who couldn't afford better doctors, and she actually worked as a triage nurse in her husband's clinic, dealing with these people who would come to her with various injuries or various illnesses with very little money, and that becomes a subject in her art. She was also a feminist. She believed in women's rights at a time before women were given the right to vote, for instance. And she believed in the plight of the lower classes and trying to change their lot in life. This painting is actually from a series of paintings on the peasant revolts. This one is called The Outbreak, and it refers, on the one hand, to the peasant revolts that occurred in the area that's now Germany during the Protestant Reformation period. So during primarily the late 1400s, early 1500s, where lower class people rose up against the power structure that was keeping them in the lower classes to try to change their lot in life. And one of the people who was a leader of this movement, who you see here in the foreground, this woman, was named Black Anna. Now here she is kind of exhorting the masses to go off and change their lot in life. Her back is turned to us, making her a bit anonymous so that we can imagine ourselves also fulfilling the role of being a leader, leading to various social upheavals and revolts and changing the world that we live in. It's important, Kathy Kollwitz is a woman artist, that she has chosen a leader who is also a woman, saying, women, you need to stand up for your rights as well here. Now again, this isn't the way that that scene would actually look. What she seems to be emphasizing is the idea of collective action, right? Every figure kind of blurs into other figures, and they all move off like a big arrow into space to go change their historical destiny. All of the lines that are used in this print are very diagonal lines meant to emphasize movement and change and to catch us up in the emotional state of a rebellion or a revolt. She was surrounded by death, as I said, and she tries to create visual equivalents to the emotional things that she sees in her life. This one's called Woman, Child, and Death, and its subject matter is a woman who is dying and trying to, hold off death because she's got a child that she wants to stay with. Now, she would have seen this firsthand. And imagine, how do you represent this feeling of a woman, struggling against her death because of her child, or a child wanting to hold on to mom, but mom's dying? I mean, that's a deep, dark, very powerful set of emotions. And what she's done here, she's manipulated form in order to express that feeling. What I mean by that is, on the one hand, these are accurate representations of a child and a mother, for the most part. But then you see the exaggeration of this neck being twisted back. She's actually being torn into this deep void of darkness that represents death by a skeletal figure, a symbol of death, by the hair, wrenching her back. She's fighting against it with all of her strength. Look at this gigantic, very strong muscle here in the thigh. That's not this thigh. She's emphasizing that to show the struggle. So she's manipulating form in order to express this really deep, dark human emotion. Or, the other side of the equation, every parent's deepest nightmare, their child dying before they do. Here's a woman, it's called Woman and Child, where the child is dying, and the mother is trying to embrace this child, and it almost looks as if she's trying to absorb the child back into her to protect it. You can see the face being separated, but the body starts to become one with the mother here. Unlike other representations of grief, here that face is dissolved into an almost animalistic, cry, something that is really, really primal. All of this, again, not the way something really looks per se, but a visual equivalent of an emotional state. The Expressionist painters also had another goal, and it's something we've implied so far, but we haven't quite said out loud. They believed that the visual qualities of painting might be thought of as a universal language. What I mean by this is, I think you all know, with a little bit of thinking about this, that words are conventional symbols for things. So for instance, in English we say apple to reference a particular fruit, but if you're in France they would use the word pomme, and if you're in Spain they would use another word for apple. Those sounds and those letters that create the words are conventions. They don't have any universal applicability. You need to learn them and learn that the word apple stands in for a particular fruit. But what if you thought that color and line and shape and texture, all the building blocks of painting, actually affected us at a deep kind of psychological level and impacted us all the same? It wouldn't matter which culture you came from or what the associations even were with colors. At a deep level, let's say red impacts us in a particular way and certain shades of blue impact us in another way. They were interested then in the idea of abstracting art to the basic building blocks of color, line, and shape, and all of those, qualities of the form elements, because they thought that these things might speak to us at a universal level. What you're looking at here is something that was a support for this idea. There was a movement at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. There are many of them, mystical religious movements, in this case, theosophy, in which the theosophists, this kind of mixing together of religion and science and philosophy, started to create books and arguments that were synonymous with the goals of these expressionist painters, meaning what you're looking at here is basically a color chart that ascribes to each one of these colors an emotional state, so that this kind of blue is associated with high spirituality and so forth. Or the theosophist created what were called thought forms, color plus line and shape, that were meant to, again, impact us at a deep psychological level as a universal language and speak about particular concepts or ideas through just the abstract form qualities of imagery. In this case, for instance, this form was meant to be the visual equivalent of the idea of watchful jealousy or anxiety or affection here. Now, one of the painters who was deeply interested in theosophy and the idea of the abstract qualities or formal qualities of painting as a universal language was the Russian-born painter Vasily Kandinsky. This is his work called Composition Number 2. It's really study for Composition Number 2. And you can see that this has gotten really, really abstract, hasn't it? It's hard to even pick out figural forms here. And the reason for that is that Kandinsky thought that color and line and shape and so forth had a deep kind of psychic impact on us that could speak to us all in a universal way. And his great kind of analogy for this, once again, came through music, where he said that, listen to this quote. He said, in relation to color directly influences the soul. And what he meant by the soul is kind of the deep, primal, psychological element of human beings. Then he went on to say, color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, and the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another purposefully to cause vibrations in the soul. Now, what he means by this is that a particular color will vibrate inside us or resonate inside us at a deep psychological level that we might not even be aware of, but it doesn't matter which society you come from, which culture you come from, what your symbolism is, colors will affect us all in the same way. They're like words in a sentence, right? And so here he is using color and line and shape and so forth so as to communicate a message. Now, with that being said, Kandinsky didn't think we were ready for complete abstraction yet, and so there are what are called veiled symbols in here, or veiled imagery. In the foreground is a man on a blue horse here, and a man on a white horse here, either in battle or running off into the distance. The movement, by the way, that Kandinsky was associated with was called the Blue Rider, or Der Blaue Reiter, which we're not going to go into here, but it has to do with an expressionist movement in Germany. If you think of this white kind of shape in the middle as something that separates the left from the right hand of the picture, you'll notice that off on the left-hand side of the picture, you have a whole bunch of symbolism that is associated with the Bible, in particular the idea of an apocalypse, or something that is a kind of reset button that happens in the Bible all the time, such as the Great Flood, where Noah builds the ark. Here in the foreground, there are these wave shapes encroaching upon these figures, threatening to, to drown them all. Or in the distance, you see towers of some type of buildings collapsing into the background, or this figure floating off on a boat. This is all apocalyptic imagery. On the other side of the picture, you see Arcadian imagery, imagery of utopia and happiness, figures who are lying in the grass, children playing games with those little hoops that they used to play with, some kind of pergola back here in a beautiful garden. So what is he getting at? Well, believe it or not, around the time period that he painted this, which is before World War I, a lot of people really believed that if we were to get a revolution in society that would really change things, move us much more quickly into a progressive society, we would need a big war or some kind of apocalypse to clear off all what they call the dead wood of society, to create a tabula rasa, or a blank slate from which a new, more progressive modern society would emerge. And that's what he's trying to get at here. On the left-hand side are symbols of an apocalypse, and on the right-hand side is the beautiful utopia that will emerge from that reset button. So the imagery gives you the specifics of the message, but really, and this is key, it's the colors and the lines and the shapes that are supposed to communicate these messages. On the left-hand side, lots of deep blues, lots of jagged lines, lots of things falling over. And on the right-hand side, lots of vibrant colors, lots of things that speak of joy and pleasure. I just bring this in because I love Franz Marc. He was a member of Der Blaue Reiter as well, the Blue Rider group that Kandinsky was in. But Franz Marc was really interested in creating works of art that would break down what he thought was a society that really was too anthropocentric, which means human-oriented. In other words, humans tend to think they are the most important thing in the world, and that nature and that animals are just there for them. They don't stop to think, for instance, what the experience of the world is like for other creatures in the world, or at least that tends to be the case in Western societies. And so Franz Marc was interested in the question of the kind of the being in the world, the way that animals experience their nature, and he painted scenes over and over again of things like horses, interacting with their natural environment. He also had ideas about the spiritual qualities of horses. He thought they were the most kind of noble and spiritual of creatures, and he thought that blue was the most spiritual color, so he paints them all blue. He thought that nature was best rendered by reds, which were a material color, so really kind of direct symbolism. We'll end up today looking at another artist sometimes associated with Expressionism, but it's a different kind of Expressionism entirely, and that's the artist Henri Matisse. So we're back in France now, and Henri Matisse, for me and for most people, represents a type of art that is really about producing pleasure for us. And the pleasure that it produces for us is not by creating figures that are associated with things we gain pleasure from, but just using color and line and shape so as to produce some type of beauty for us. In other words, in this work called The Woman with a Hat, which was painted during a time that Henri Matisse was a member of a group of painters that were dubbed the Fauves. You'll read about this, the wild beasts, because when they exhibited these works, everyone thought that they're what we call non-local colors, colors that don't have anything to do with the original color of something, made them like wild beasts. They were breaking all the rules of classicism and so forth. When he painted this, what he was really trying to get at is, he starts with a woman wearing a big hat, but he's not trying to show you what she looks like, not trying to show her the color of her hair. What he's trying to do is put together combinations of colors and lines and shapes in such a way that they produce pleasure in us. Or another way to put this is, if you've ever looked at an abstract, series of colors and shapes and lines and thought, oh, I love that abstract pattern, he's trying to do the same thing in painting. And perhaps the most famous example, and the one that I'm going to spend the most time on, is this one called The Joy of Life, is the usual translation of this. A big painting by Henri Matisse, in which what he's done on the one hand is filled the entire painting with scenes of things that he thinks people will find pleasure in or take pleasure in. So you've got a beautiful landscape. You've got, nudes kind of frolicking in the grass and dancing. You've got, people making out over here and playing music. These are all things that are associated with pleasure, of course. But, the majority of this painting is really about combinations of really vibrant, beautiful colors and arabesquing lines in combination with each other. What he wanted was a picture, as he said, that is like your favorite armchair, where when you get home from work, you just sink into it and gain pleasure in it. He doesn't have a message to you. He's not trying to say to you, hey, this is what this is all about. What he's trying to do is create something that will just bring you visual pleasure. And this is something that, again, is very modernist. In other words, not trying to paint an accurate representation of a female nude. Instead, he's abstracting or simplifying it to its basic shapes, beautiful combinations of line and color. Right? Because he wants to produce pleasure through that line and that color rather than the association with a nude. Or another way to put this is, if on the one hand, and you'll read about this next week when we talk about Clive Bell and Roger Fry and formalist criticism in the essay that you have called An Aesthetic Hypothesis, many critics, formalist critics, and Matisse as well, thought that the strength of painting was that it could, through the form elements, color, line, shape, and so forth, produce in us a particular kind of pleasure that you couldn't get anywhere else, which they called an aesthetic emotion, the feeling that comes from our interaction with what they called significant form, which is the color, line, and shape, and so forth. So that if you look at this picture, for instance, and you're saying, hey, I love dancing, and I like nudes, and I like playing music, and over here I like playing music to goats, or whatever the hell's going on over here. You're having an associative emotion. You're taking pleasure from this because you're seeing something in the picture that you also like in everyday life, and you're making an association. I like dancing, therefore I like this picture because it shows dancing. That's not what these artists were about. What they were about is saying, I like this painting because of the color combinations, because of the use of line, because of the composition of all of these figures in space. It's about the formal elements of painting producing pleasure more than it's about the imagery within the picture, which is about associative pleasures. So for instance here, in Matisse's The Dance, this isn't the way human form looks. What he's done is he's simplified all these forms to their kind of basic elements, beautiful, shapes, beautiful curves to the body, incredibly interesting color combinations, these vibrant blues next to each other, offset by the brick red of the figures here, to express on the one hand the feeling of exuberance associated with dance, but also to give you the feeling of beauty through the colors and the lines and the shapes. Later in his life, he even turned that dance into a big mural. Okay, well that's it for this week. On Matisse, remember that we'll pick up these ideas about significant form and aesthetic emotion and the idea of formalist criticism, or art that is about producing pleasure through the form elements, next week. All right. Until then,